Welcome again to our Near-Death Experience interview series. I'm Robert Mays. Suzanne and I have researched near-death experiences for the past 15 years. We are interviewing people who have had an NDE and who have also received visions of future world events. These interviews are part of our research project that's exploring NDErs' insights into the deeper meaning of the challenges currently facing humanity, such as the pandemic and the social and political polarization of our society. What advice do NDErs have in coping with and responding to these challenges? We'll pause here to bring in today's guest.
We are here again with Rabbi Stephen Robbins of Congregation Neve Shalom in Los Angeles. He is also co-founder of the Academy for Jewish Religion California, the first trans-denominational rabbinic and cantorial school. Stephen is also a clinical psychologist with a specialty in the psychoneuroimmunology of trauma. During each of his 7 NDEs, he received a prophetic vision, a message, or a mission. We will continue to explore these experiences in this session. Welcome, Rabbi Robbins.
Again, thank you so much for inviting me back again to unpack all of the experiences and the knowledge that has come to me in all of these moments.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Your experience in the previous interviews, you talked about your experience of having two descent lines, one from your familial descent and from your spiritual descent. Can you talk about that some more?
My experience has began as I was becoming a soul and entering into the body, which eventually would be born dead and then revived. And that is that as I was being brought more and more into corporeality, into physicality, the quote, angelic presences, which people would call them, but the guides were joined by ancestors. Um, and they identified themselves as to whether or not they were familial or spiritual. In other words, the familial were those who I have a genetic historical continuity, and the spiritual descent were those with whom I share a common tikkun or purpose, and much of that purpose is about what I'm to accomplish in the world that I come into, and that sometimes those descent lines don't merge, and sometimes they do. And what I was told is that in my particular case, the two merged because of my great grandfather, Avram Yosef Luria, who was both my great grandfather and part of this Lurianic rabbinic family that had such a profound impact in the development of mystic thought, etc., in the Middle East, in Israel, and in Europe, so that my descent came from a nexus of those combinations, and then it being transferred to me through my grandmother to me at my conception as it began, and the perception that I was receiving both wisdom and guidance and warning and concern from these two streams of my life was both very rewarding and sometimes very confusing. because they didn't always match with each other.
Mm.
And there were times I had to tell them to be quiet. It'd been a long time since they had been in the world, and the world that they lived in is very different than the world I lived in. And what they were asking me to do, I couldn't do in this world. So just be quiet and let me try and work through the wisdom you've given me.
Yeah.
And most of the time, they would agree. Uh, and if they wanted to get some information or learning to me, it generally came through what would be called the Abba, the head of this whole group of presences that would be delivering the message to me. And that would be the sole presence of Isaac Luria, who was part of the family chain of which I was born into. But there are others who are also involved, not only in the Jewish descent line, Jewish, but in other spiritual figures from other religious traditions and scientific traditions who are also feeding me information, which is why I became so interested in neurobiology, in cellular chemistry, in brain development, and then going into studying extreme physics. And their guidance opened constantly my sense of the perception that all of it is really integrated into this great network. And if I was willing to let my consciousness be bigger than my brain, that I would find a way to integrate these strands of knowing into some coherent form of expression, which is a big part of what you and Ians are making it possible for me to do. So these two descent lines, sometimes in my experience, many of the people I work with who are all highly empathic people and who live in great difficulty, struggle with being so empathic, to understand themselves, ultimately come to an understanding that the empathy needed to be balanced with some sense of structure
Yeah.
so that one would not be sucked into what was going on around you, but you could be empathic without being caught in it. And one of the things I discovered with highly empathic people is that they themselves have multiple descent lines.
Ah,
And much of our gifts, our talents, and many of our deficits are familial. And ironically, some of the spiritual descent line figures themselves have cognitive or emotional difficulties, which also come to us. And so sometimes it's hard to know exactly where it all fits. So I don't try and figure it out. I simply let it happen the way I do with most everything.
yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, did that clarify it?
Yes. And this and so how do you resolve your life purpose, or what your mission is now? Is that coming from the latest near death experience, or is that how does that resolve?
There is no resolution, there is no answer, there are only continually unfolding responses.
Ah,
Now, people will say to me, Steve, give me an answer. And I say, there is no answer in this universe, in this existence, because we live in an existence which is constantly unfolding and incomplete. So an answer means it's this way and nothing else.
ah,
A response is how do we respond to what is present in front of us without getting trapped in a rigidity that keeps us from the response moving us forward. For me, it was always like surfing or sailing or bike riding, especially down the side of a mountain. It's learning how to balance as things are constantly shifting and moving. So, what I deal with is what's in front of me and what I'm going through at the moment. And as I stay in the present, in the moment, I am given lots of different kinds of information and teaching, sometimes an impression or an image of someone who may come into my life, of some opportunity. Sometimes it's very specific, like ions.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's specific people who I know or who I'm told will come into my life. And I don't come out, excuse me, and try and reach for those. I simply wait until the opportunity is given and then I respond.
Okay. Thank you.
So Stephen, can you say more about something you mentioned earlier in our other interviews about the veils of darkness that you encountered in your seventh NDE, and how might this refer to the current time we're in right now?
Uh, This is always very painful and it's difficult. I encountered these darknesses through the anguish and the grief, the anger, and the astonishment of these souls who died, who didn't have to die, who essentially were sacrificed to satisfy the needs of people in power. And the majority of them being what we would call people of color. But from the greater perspective is that they were people who filled everyday lives and did great pieces of human work, but because they were considered to be somehow less important, they were considered expendable. And the movement in this country since the murder of George Floyd has been to restructure our understanding of how people in this country have been discounted for several hundred years, and the means of lifting them up so that they are dealt with as equals and as valuable as others to fulfill what the Constitution of the United States says. All men, meaning all humans, are created equal, endowed with their Creator with inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And for us, the translation of life means health, support. They are entitled to being alive, not to being ignored so that they can die. So these veils of darkness, which surrounded all of these people, were like the veils of darkness I encountered during the period of my own abuse as a 12-year-old, and as I have worked over the years with people of multiple backgrounds, multiple sexes and orientations who had been abused. And these veils of darkness which come from trauma, from the dissociation that calls forth this sense of not being able to perceive the truth, quote unquote, of what really happened, rather than being stuck in the deep freeze of withdrawing from the experience because you can't sustain yourself. It's too overwhelming. I have never been gifted with the capacity to dissociate. There's times I wish I could,
Yeah.
but I've always been present in all the traumas I've gone through. So I have been more and more able to articulate it. And what I see in these veils of darkness is what we would call evil. And what they are is they take the light, the brightness, the Holy Spirit that's inside each of us, and they veil it so that it can't shine forth, and they suck the energy of that light into themselves. But as it does, it causes pain. And so they only want to create more, more lies, more deception, more disruption that will keep the person, the group, the family, the people separate and uh, isolated from the other, which is what's happening now, not just in the United States, but around the world. And the challenge is, do we peer through the veil and they're really gossamer and rip them apart so that the light that's present in all of us and in all of existence shines into the same place so that we are all freed from the capacity of following lies and deception and confusion, and therefore surrendering our own holy, sacred purpose that's imbued in everybody's soul? Or do we surrender our souls to the veils of darkness so that we want them to guide us through our confusion?
Let's go on to the another topic. Um, you've mentioned in the past that the gifts that we have, our talents that we've been given, are not gifts, they're our obligation. Can you expound on that, please?
Yeah, I have a talent for speaking. I have a talent for being able to speak without having a note in front of me or reading anything. People have said, can you teach me how to do that? And I can on some level, but on another level, I'm this way because it's part of my tikkun to be able to teach and respond in the moment as authentically as I'm able to with what limited knowledge, knowing I have. The obligation that goes with that is being able to, and sometimes I don't, to also withhold the impetuosity of that gift so that I don't stick both feet in my mouth at the same time. The I have other talents and gifts that are applied in other ways. Each of us, and I have deficits, my learning disabilities, some of my emotional quirks. In the beginning, I, like everybody else, said, I got to learn to do math. I got to learn to write better. I've got to learn to read better. And when I entered Hebrew Union College at 16, and I was handed these big textbooks on biblical criticism and ancient history and Hebrew text, I felt at home, and I was able to read them when I couldn't read anything else.
Wow.
And it's not that I didn't have the facility to read or to understand, or what later turned into be able to write very large term papers. It was that I was not learning about something that was obligated to me, but I was learning something that fit into my identity, I, the I am here. And from those first classes in which I was 16 and everybody else was in their 20s and a couple even older, and when I would respond to what I was reading, there would be kind of a look at me like, what are you? And I felt so peaceful and at home, unlike sitting in my high school classes that it was a joy to read, to study, to learn, to write, and eventually to speak because I was in my genre. My particular form of intelligence had to do with religion, spirituality, history, and psychology and biblical text, which overwhelmed me in surprise. As a child, though, the only place I ever really felt comfortable was in synagogue or in uh, religious school classes in which I would excel. When I was a boy, um, before University Synagogue exploded into this big place, there was an older man named Savetnik who somehow we met. I was, a little kid, 8, 9, 10 years old. And when the sermon would start on Friday night, he'd look across to me and go like this. And we'd walk out together and we'd sit and talk for an hour until my parents would come in and get me and say, the services are coming to an end. And there was this kind of running joke between the old guy and the kid who seemed to have a friendship. And Mr. Savetnik was a Holocaust survivor. And I once said to him later on in the years, why do you pay so much attention to a boy? And he said, before Hitler came, I had a school filled with many boys. And I was sad that I could not go with them. And I was told that one day I would find one boy and that one boy would be the vessel into which I would pour my knowledge. And apparently, you're that boy. And we met continually over the years until just before my 13th birthday and my bar mitzvah. Savetnik died along with my grandmother. And all of that constant learning came to an end. And it then propelled me 3 years later into rabbinic studies. But that's where knowledge and experience came together for me and brought me to a sense of awakening. Suddenly I found my mind, but not my mind, I found my consciousness, my soul. And even with my brain deficits, this knowledge went in like a plug-in, and suddenly it was there. Um, I was overjoyed and astounded, and I was getting A's in these classes, which were considered to be graduate level. Uh, my first paper in uh, biblical criticism was 80 pages, which, blew everybody away. And I said I was asked to prove something. I went through all the literature, and this is what I came up with. The rest of the guys turned in 20, 30 pages. And the professor said, Steve, you don't have to overdo it and show everything you know. You only need to answer the question, which has always been my problem anyway. The So that I followed what were the gifts I had because those were really the paths that were simple and easy for me where I fit. But in Western education, we keep taking kids whose talents or capacities don't lead them down the conventional path, and we force them to go get fixed. And you and I know that it usually doesn't work. So all three of my kids who inherited my learning disabilities one way or another all went very different ways. One into dance, one graduated the Chicago Art Institute, and the other as a computer tech. And people said, how can you let your kids wander like that? And I said, I don't let my kids do anything. I support the way in which my children need to go
Yeah.
to find the best avenue for them to learn and to add to the world. And that's been my philosophy. No, not my philosophy. That's been my practice, my style when I work with people, especially around NDEs. And that is that when we are pulled into the places where we are not supposed to go, we are constantly beset with one impediment after another. But when we take the path that's open to us, suddenly not only does that become wider, but the deficits also begin to be lifted. So I, who had taken no science, wrote my dissertation almost all on science
Yeah.
and brain science and neurophysiology, neuroanatomy, cellular structures, etc. And I got it right. So how did I do it? And that was that when I read a certain book, my mind exploded and suddenly I just knew where it all fit together.
Yeah.
And so I discovered that in the tikkun, if I followed that which was being offered to me, that it wasn't a gift, that it was an obligation.
Right.
The same happened with my wife singing and her art. Because when we met, she wouldn't sing
Uh,
and she didn't do any art. Everything was hidden. And then one day, by accident, I heard her sing, and I said, "Was that you?" And she said, "Yeah, that was me." And so I made a commitment that someday she would sing. And it only took 20 years. But finally, now she's a cantor with a glorious voice. And I always said, "You're a great teacher." She said, "Oh, I can't teach anything." And now she's a rabbi, writing for the Jewish Journal, publishing books, doing everything which are not attached to me, but flow out of her own gifts.
right.
She's a very talented artist, and my job was not to tell her to do anything, but to simply help her find the path that opened up her talents. And I kept saying to her, "You can't have a voice like that and not use it,
Right.
because that voice doesn't belong to you. It was given to you to use."
Yeah.
And now she does.
Yeah.
So that's the way I feel, particularly about people I work with who've had NDEs.
Oh,
These experiences are about giving us an understanding of the place we serve in this world in order to ease people's fears and anxieties about death. That's why I was given the message about ions.
yeah. So a number of NDErs um, come back and they have gifts that scare them. You know, they for example, several NDErs that we've read about have had what was called spontaneous mediumship experiences. In other words, they
Yeah.
encounter someone and they're given a message. Tell this person this, and
Yeah.
they don't want to do that, or they're given some of the NDErs that we are studying are given the gift of prophetic visions, and they don't want them. It's extremely disturbing for them to
Yes.
see a plane crash and they can't do anything about it, and yet there it happens. And we feel that some of in those cases, those are given as a kind of confirmation of the validity of their prophetic visions, but they want to shut off these psychic abilities that they've been given after
And they can't.
they
And the more they, quote, try to shut them off, the more it pushes back and creates even greater dissonance and disturbance. The issue is, how do they welcome it in so that they learn how to use it rather than to be used by it?
yeah,
Because these gifts of media, what is called mediumship, which I'm very uncomfortable with, has to do with with a highly intensified empathic capacities.
Yeah.
People have said, you must be a medium. You picked me up right away. You told me about me before I even opened my mouth. And I said, I'm not a medium. I'm just highly empathic. And all of the prophets who are called, every single one of them resists. They don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Leave me alone. I
Yeah.
want to live a normal, happy life.
Right.
Why do I have to do this? Amos, Jeremiah, Elijah, they all plead to not be chosen. And yet, when they are chosen, they know that that's what they're there for. And so they accept this life of speaking forth for God. And most of the time, it produces enemies, not a lot of friends.
Right. Right.
So those who develop mediumship or prophetic visions and who don't speak, I would expect that, and it's their way of finding some protection. We in IONS, those of us who can speak and talk about this, offer ourselves to be vessels of knowing and holding so these people can at least spew it out in a way in which they don't have to be afraid.
Right.
They're not being judged. I mean, that's what happened to me here. So much of what I say, I never said out loud until IONS, even to my wife,
Mm.
because I sound crazy enough as it is. But now it would have been even more so.
Yeah.
And it was only with the gift of uh, Ions and Chuck and you two that I'm finally finding ways to express this that don't use the same words that everybody else uses.
Yeah.
So I don't call myself a healer. I don't call myself a medium. I don't label myself as anything other than what I am. And the rest of that can be left to anybody else who wants to find a label because I won't accept them.
Yeah.
Can we go back to the first thing we talked about regarding your familial and your spiritual lineage? Um, there, the these are the beings on the other side of the threshold,
Yes,
and they're not incarnated.
no,
Um, and there's the notion many of us have. Well, they know everything that's happening on Earth. They can see everything. They can understand everything. But in your experience, have you found that it's a two-way communication that's needed? In other words, the angels, if you want to call them angels, or these holy presences, they need, when they are in converse with you, are they seeking your experience of the earth that they cannot have, they do not have? Um,
yes. And they are seeking to find ways to give me knowing skills in order to help others find their pathways toward their tikkun, their spiritual purpose, and their talents.
so would you
And
say
it is a two-way process.
so would you say that the both sides need each other?
Oh, absolutely. Um, this world is not an accident. It is a holy intention, just like the planets and the galaxies around us. The whole of the physical plane of existence is not an accident. It is an intention. It is unfinished and expanding at an ever increasing rate as more and more capacity to unfold knowledge and experience is happening, at least in our world, at every level of endeavor, from the smallest of molecules and particles to the greatest of the structures of the galaxy. That endeavor matches something that is a comment, an old comment in Genesis, and says that Adam, that humans are meant to be omniscient, that is to know it all, because we are conceived knowing it all, and that each of us spends our life chasing after the knowledge that says, I think I know that, but why do I know that? But I think that's where I need to go. Or somebody says something, or a book or a movie, and suddenly it's like, that's it. I've got to go that way. And it always happens as a surprise. Remember, I go back to the issue of the surprise. Because until we are startled by something that breaks the conventional boundaries in which we live, and we see outside the confines of what is familiar and comfortable, and then like Moses in the bush, or Elijah in the cave, or Jeremiah at the temple, at that moment, if we turn away and the door closes, it means all of that came from it will not have happened.
Mm.
And so the image that I always make, if Moses had not turned aside, we wouldn't be standing here talking on Zoom, of all things, our own burning bushes. That, and it is the surprise, or what some people say, the aha moment, but it is always a startle. And then we turn into the startle, and a whole new world opens up. It is why whenever I'm surprised by something, I laugh at it rather than withdraw.
Yeah.
You can see very much in the startle response of people who are traumatized. Some people have no startle at all. They're so withdrawn and uh, unfeeling. And some people will jump out of their skins of something that is a startle, and it's because they have hypervigilant um, autonomic systems. And in between, each of us have a startle component somewhere. And where the startle is the place of surprise. At least that's one of them. It's the simplest one to explain. And the others have to do with love and intimacy. The others have to do with work and accomplishment, with study and learning. One has to do with living in the present, not in the past or the future. Because remember, in our world, time, space, substance is all linear.
Mm.
But in the upper worlds, or in the outer worlds, time and space is all circular, and everything is happening all at once. The issue is, where do we choose to focus when we're in the process of the unfolding? So that when at the depth of teaching people a kind of spiritual discipline, it is to stand at the center of a sphere and to perceive all that's going on around you in the sphere. And that is the beginning of having a vision, experience, sight of everything that's happening now at this moment.
Yeah.
And in some of those places you belong, and in many of them you don't belong. And one of the great medievalists, Kabbalist Jikatia, said that the first sin is begins by going where you don't belong, like the serpent moving from its place with God and sticking his head into the garden and being jealous of the relationship between Adam and Eve, and so has to destroy it because he can't have it. But that's the way so much happens in this world, is if I can't have it, then why should you have it? So let's destroy it, since my jealousy turns to envy, and envy tells me that I'm not entitled to it because I'm not good enough. And so we stick ourselves in the places we don't belong. We reach we reach too far in the wrong direction, rather than not reaching far enough in the right direction that will lead us to more and more surprises. So it is this startle, the surprise, and the laughter at something opening that is both frightening as well as exciting. That's like the Halloween piece of surprising you, scaring you, and laughing at the same time. So my experience of the spiritual moments are these surprises, these startles that suddenly shake you.
Yeah.
And I say, I didn't know that.
Right. 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 I didn't see that. Yes. I'm afraid that we are out of time now, and so we will need to bring this to a close, and we'll see how we will proceed in the future. But I
Thank
thank
you.
you very, very much for all of these uh, opportunities to speak with you. Thank you.
Again, it's my privilege and my honor and my profound gratitude to the two of you and to Ians for making it possible for me to. Sorry, I get very emotional about this. To speak my soul
Yes.
instead of trying to explain me.
Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll close it now.